At the beginning, no one found it strange. The planet had spent months in constant alert, sensors adjusting readings, systems recalculating climate patterns, official communiques appearing with each new report. Kálior lived in a state of continuous observation, like a patient recently out of a serious surgery, surrounded by machines that never shut down. Then, suddenly, everything became quiet. No new warning, no significant deviation, no strange vibration beneath the ground. The silence was received as relief. The global assemblies released optimistic statements. They spoke of progressive stabilization, of natural recovery, of a planet that had finally found its new balance. Analysts used safe, comforting words, words that sounded like closure. The worst had passed. Few noticed that something essential had disappeared along with the alerts. The whispers of the Axis ceased without warning. For weeks they had been felt by millions of people, a deep, almost imperceptible vibration that appeared mainly at night. It was not a sound nor a classic tremor. It was more a sensation, as if the planet itself were breathing slowly beneath the surface. And then, nothing. There was no gradual reduction. There was no transition. They simply stopped. For most people, this meant only that the planet was healed. The whispers were treated as a side effect of the global trauma, a collective psychological response to months of fear. The silence, therefore, seemed logical. But to some, it sounded wrong. These people could not explain why. They had no graphs nor technical arguments. They simply felt the absence, something that had always been there, something they only noticed after losing it had disappeared. Like when the heart stops hurting after a crisis, and that, instead of reassuring, frightens. The first reports came from regions completely different from one another. Farmers, urban workers, children, elderly people, people who had never spoken to each other, describing the same sensation, a kind of emptiness, as if the world were distant. The planet was still spinning, the sun was still rising, the seasons still existed, but something was no longer present. The sensors confirmed normality. The rotation remained within parameters. Atmospheric currents adjusted according to statistical models. No system registered imminent danger. Even so, the data had an uncomfortable detail. They were stable too much. Before the collapse, even in the most balanced periods, there were always micro-variations, noise, small deviations that did not mean failure, but life. A living planet was never perfectly predictable. Now, Kálior was. The scientific community began to divide silently. Publicly, the report spoke of success. Behind the scenes, some researchers went back to comparing old readings with current ones. They were not looking for large anomalies, they were looking for absence, and they found it. The planet no longer reacted to smaller stimuli. Natural energy discharges, spontaneous climatic adjustments, even low-intensity tectonic events no longer produced secondary responses. Everything happened and ended there, without echo. It was as if Kálior had learned to ignore. Meanwhile, far from public attention, Project Axis Zero advanced. Officially, it was an orbital security program. No direct interference with the planet, no climate control, nothing that resembled the old gravitational anchors. The discourse was careful, almost humble. The structure would have only one function: to absorb excesses. If the planet accumulated too much energy, the orbital network would dampen it. If internal pressures became unstable, the orbit would compensate. Nothing invasive, nothing permanent. The idea was simple enough to seem inevitable, and precisely because of that, almost no one questioned it. When the first segment of Axis Zero went into operation, the planet did not react. No vibration, no climatic alteration, no warning. the silence deepened. The initial reports were celebrated. Internal oscillations had decreased. Core activity seemed more uniform. Analysts called that planetary maturity. For the first time since the restart of rotation, Kálior seemed completely under control. And that should have been the greatest warning of all, because nothing living remains perfectly controlled without a cost. Little by little, something strange began to manifest on the surface, not as disaster, but as sensation. The days seemed too similar. The seasons existed, but without clear identity. Changes came without emotional contrast. People described a strangely smooth routine, without peaks, without drops, without intensity. There was no immediate pain, but there was also no vitality. It was like living inside a perfectly regulated environment, comfortable, predictable, and deeply empty. In the old archives of the Order of the Axis, a forgotten concept began to circulate again among a few scholars: exchange. The texts spoke of a planet that did not survive only by spinning, but by constantly exchanging energy with space, with its orbit, with its own internal imperfections. Chaos was not a defect, it was part of the functioning. By trying to dampen everything, Axis Zero was not protecting Kálior, it was isolating it. When the first internal alerts appeared, they did not come from the surface, but from the core. Readings showed something subtle, almost elegant, a microscopic reduction in energy transfer between internal layers. Nothing alarming in isolation, but persistent. Kálior was not entering a collapse, it was shutting down. The attempt at reversal was discussed too late. The orbital structure had integrated deeply into the forces it intended only to balance. Shutting it down abruptly could generate an inverse effect, releasing accumulated tensions all at once. Once again, civilization found itself facing the same mistake: too much control, too little response. The difference was that this time, the planet did not react with chaos, it reacted with silence. The whispers did not return, no warning appeared, no vibration crossed the ground. Kálior spun smoothly, wrapped in artificial structures that reflected the light of the nearby star. From space, it looked like a serene world, perfectly stable. But the hidden data told a different story. The rotation was decreasing, imperceptible to most, elegant, constant, and for the first time since the beginning of the entire crisis, no one was shouting, because the planet was no longer shouting. At the beginning, the deceleration was treated as noise. The values were within acceptable margins. Small deviations had always existed, even before the anchor crisis. A planet was never a perfect clock. The official reports used familiar terms: statistical fluctuation, orbital accommodation, transitory adjustment. Nothing that justified panic. But there was an uncomfortable detail that did not appear in the public graphs. The deceleration did not oscillate. It was constant. Always in the same direction, always at the same pace, always silent. Kálior was not unstable, it was decided. The oldest sensors, those inherited from the time before the collapse, began to record something that modern systems no longer captured: the absence of micro-chaos. The planet no longer presented those small imperfections that previously served as a release valve. Everything flowed too cleanly. And living systems do not work like that. The oldest scientists were the first to fall silent. They recognized the pattern, even without being able to explain it completely. They had seen something similar before, not in planets, but in systems too closed, in organisms subjected to excessive control. Before failure came quiet. Project Axis Zero remained active. Officially, shutting it down at this moment would be irresponsible. Simulations indicated that an abrupt removal could release accumulated tensions and cause a collapse faster than the deceleration itself. The system had become part of the current balance, however artificial it was. Civilization was trapped by its own solution. Meanwhile, on the surface, the emotional change began to become impossible to ignore. There were no revolts. There was no despair. There was no collective fear. There was apathy. People continued working, moving, talking. But something essential seemed to have shut down along with the whispers of the Axis. The sense of belonging to the planet had disappeared. Kálior was no longer felt as a living home, but as a functional setting. The arts lost intensity. Music became repetitive. Dreams shorter. Psychologists tried to explain it as delayed collective trauma. Sociologists spoke of post-crisis fatigue. But none of these theories explained why the sensation was so uniform, so synchronized. It was as if everyone were living on top of something that was no longer living back. In the archives of the old Order of the Axis, a passage ignored for decades began to gain prominence. It was not a technical warning, nor a prophecy. It was a simple observation. When the planet stops responding, it is not because it is weak, it is because it is protecting itself. The sentence circulated discreetly among researchers. It was never cited in public transmissions. It sounded too dangerous. It implied something that no one wanted to admit, that the planet could choose how to react, or how not to react. The final attempts at indirect communication began too late. Small stimuli were applied to the orbital system, seeking to provoke any type of measurable response, not to correct, but to test. Nothing happened. No amplification, no secondary reaction, no return. The planet did not oppose, it did not resist, it did not warn, it simply continued decelerating, very slowly, with absolute precision. The global assemblies collapsed conceptually before collapsing politically. There was no protocol for a planet that failed without failing. There was no clear emergency. There was no visible disaster. There was no enemy to point at. The problem was too subtle to generate mass mobilization, but too large to be ignored by those who understood the real data. Civilization was trapped in a paradox. Acting seemed too risky, not acting seemed too comfortable, and the planet continued. From space, Kálior remained beautiful. The Axis Zero structures reflected the star's light like a protective ring. Rotation still existed, day still rose, night still fell. Nothing indicated immediate collapse. But on deep scales, something was ending. The deceleration crossed a silent threshold when the planet completed a cycle slightly longer than the previous one. The difference was too small to be perceived without instruments. Even so, it marked an irreversible point. It was no longer a deviation, it was a consolidated trend. The last scientists who tried to sound a public warning did not use technical words. They knew no one would listen. They used simpler language, almost primitive. They said the planet seemed tired. Not tired in the physical sense, but in the sense of someone who had already responded too much, who had already adjusted too much, who had already yielded too much. A system that, upon realizing that every response generates new interference, decides to reduce contact. Silence as defense. The project to shut down Axis Zero began to be drafted, but no one knew if there would be time. Each simulation generated scenarios too extreme. In some, the planet reacted violently. In others, it simply did not react. That second result was the most disturbing, because it meant that Kálior could continue decelerating even after the removal of everything, as if it had learned that responding was no longer worth it. The last transmission before the shutdown of public data was not dramatic. There was no solemn statement nor calls to unity, just a continuous image of the planet spinning in space, transmitted for hours. A world apparently at peace. Some found it comforting, others felt a discomfort difficult to name. Because the movement still existed, but it no longer seemed guaranteed. And at some point, too deep to be measured, perhaps the planet had made a simple decision. Not to fight, not to react, not to warn, just to slow down. And let those who depended on it realize too late that absolute control does not sustain life, it only silences it. The planet was still spinning, but now it spun like something that is moving away, and no one knew if there would be a next warning.